Okay, so let's start shading this guy. So the first thing you should do, if it hasn't been done for you already, is you should make sure that the object has all of its X forms resetted, which you can do using the Reset X form in Utilities. And also make sure you have some decent layers and good names for things, so it's easy to quickly select and unselect stuff. So I've grabbed all the parts that are going to be metal, and I applied a Brazil 2 Advanced material. And I've removed the highlight because all the highlights are going to come from reflections of either the environment map or real reflections. Put a fall off in the reflectivity, give it a higher value since this is metal. Made the diffuse a bit darker, and then the environment map we want is the HDR that I showed you before. And I'm going to hide everything except for one of the treads, and then use that as my test as I build the metal shader. So, just so you know, at the very beginning I'm going to show you the rendering as I do the rendering tests, but later on I'm just going to cut those out so that they don't take up time. So I just applied a turbo smooth to it so that when I modeled the thing, I set it up so that it would have all the necessary geometry to look good once smoothed. And that adds nice little beveled edges to everything, so you get some nice spec hits from your environment map. Okay, I've put it inside of a Brazil utility material. Then in the bump I place some noise, and this is going to create that wavering you get on flat surfaces. And the reason I use a Brazil utility material is that it lets me apply that wavering on top of every single submaterial. So we only have one submaterial right now, but so it's no big deal, but once you start getting into more submaterials, it'll be nice to have it automatically applied to everything. And you can see already that the reflection is getting more interesting because of the bump. It allows us to see much more of the environment map instead of being completely flat. Although it's still looking a little bit odd, so we're now going to go in and we're now going to tweak the bump map. Just so you know, by the way, I'm running this on a 64-bit computer using a 64-bit copy of XP. And the final model, considering all the maps and all the geometry that's going to be applied, it's a very heavy model, and so I really recommend, if you can, moving over to 64-bit computers, because having 8 gigs of RAM is just so nice when rendering these things out. So I'm using my TextMap preview script so I can see just the results of my noise without having to render everything and getting the right size. And now I just went in and made the material glossy so that the metal will be blurred metal instead of a perfect mirror of the surface around it. So I made the diffuse a little too bright, and I really want to show off the reflection, so I'm going to go in now and make the diffuse color dark again. Although pretty soon we're going to replace that color with a bitmap. So this is looking like a pretty good start for the metal. A couple little more tweaks, and here we go. So now I've moved on to doing the color map. And I got a photograph, which I took of some scratched up material, and I took the photo, and I need to use the high pass filter in order to even out the lighting on it, which was the same technique I discussed before. And now when I make tiling textures, which is what this is going to be, I usually try to make them square. Just because it's easier to remember that the whole thing is square than trying to remember all these different aspect ratios. So I take my material and use a cloner in order to make the thing square. And I got the name cloner, by the way, from Painter. It has a whole bunch of brushes you can use to clone things, and I thought that the name was cool. So I used it to refer to my Photoshop brushes that I use to clone with. So now I use the offset in order to find those seams along the edges, and now I'm going in with my cloner brush and I'm getting rid of the seams. Also, notice when I'm doing this, I'm going to be using all my own photographs as opposed to texture libraries. There are a lot of great texture libraries out there you can use, especially if you're doing a job. In general, though, if you are going to use textures that somebody else has already made, I would try to change them enough that no one would ever be able to point at a texture and specifically say, oh, well, that texture is definitely, you know, off of this texture CD or something like that. So if you use your own textures, if you have them, then that you can just avoid that entirely because no one will have seen the textures you're using. So this is another layer I'm doing on top of the first layer, just to add some more variety to the color. That was a photograph of a dumpster that I took. And I take a few more layers and stick them together, and now I've created the color, which I'm going to be using for the color of my metal. You don't have to be too careful with the color of the metal because so much of it is reflective that the color just adds a little more variety to the surface, but it's not going to be incredibly visible because the object is so reflective. So I'm going to create my blended box map, and I'm going to use 6-sided, although later on I'm going to replace this with a 3-sided because you really don't need all 6 sides for something like this. And you see there I've added the modifiers. There's all of them on top. And they're on top of the Turbo Smooth, and that's really necessary because Turbo Smooth messes up mapping. So if you do your mapping after your Turbo Smooth, then Turbo Smooth will not mess with the mapping because it happens later on in the process. And here we go. So here is the surface with the color map that I just made, and there's the final result. So it's starting to add a little bit of extra detail in there that looks nice. Now I need a bump. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the different layers and I'm going to make a group in Photoshop called Color, and then I'm going to make another one called Bump, which is going to be a duplicate of the first one. And then I'm going to take the base layer and I'm going to adjust the levels a bit to make it more contrasty. And then I'm going to invert it because if you see, the scratches right now are white, and scratches need to bump in, so therefore the scratches need to be black in the map in order to actually be bumped into the surface. And then just add a few more scratches. I'm going to take a scratch brush that I made, and I'm going to add some more black scratches on top. And once the scratches are on there, I'm just going to get rid of a few of them using a grungy brush, just so there's some good variety. It's not uniformly scratches everywhere. Okay, now I save my PSD, which has all that in there, but then I'm going to save just the bump to a separate file. Resized it a bit, and call it Metal Bump. Now I'm going to create another box map with the bump, but this time I'm only going to create the map. I don't need to create the modifiers because the object already has the modifiers assigned to it. So I go back to my metal and drop the bump in. And let's see what the bump looks like just by itself on the surface using my text map preview script. So that's what it's going to look like, which looks pretty good. So let's try rendering the whole thing and see how it looks. So now we have some bump in there, which makes the surface look even more interesting. Now I'm going to put my metal inside of a blend material, and then the second slot I'm going to place a dirt, which I'm going to make the dirt slightly brownish. And now I need a mask to blend between the dirt areas and the metal areas, which is what that is right there. And that was just, I took a piece of paper, white paper, and then I smeared it in some dirt in my garden, and then I scanned the result. And then did a few changes to it in Photoshop, and that's the resulting map that I got. So now that's being applied with, again, my blended box map. And it's a little too uniform right now, but it's good for the moment. We'll make it a little bit smaller, because it seemed like the dirt was a little bit large for the surface. And unfortunately, because the way I'm doing this involves a bunch of different UVs from a bunch of different directions, I have to change it in 6 different spots to change the overall size. But maybe one day when we have a blended box map built into Max, we can just change one value and it'll do the whole for us. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. And I'm going to change the dirt to an ordinaire and make it a little bit rougher. Once again, everything I can do to make the surface more varied ends up looking good. And here I'm adding just a little tiny procedural bump to my dirt material, just so, once again, it's just a little bit more complex, visually complex, so that it's not just the same bump everywhere on the entire surface. And there we have it. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create different kinds of metal. I'm going to create 4 different kinds. And the way I'm going to do it is in each one of the multi-ID maps, I'm going to create a composite, and the composite is my original color along with a solid color that is being multiplied on top. And I'm going to change each of those solid colors so that they're slightly different. And the result is I'm basically taking my original color map and making darker and lighter versions of it procedurally inside of the 3D app. So that one's going to be sort of a bit darker gray. The third version is going to be an even darker version of it. And then this one's going to be a gold version. So that gets multiplied on top of the original one, and that tints it. And this one, I put an output in. I'm going to make it even brighter than the first one. Okay, so the next thing is I now need to apply material modifiers to say which of the 4 different colors is going to be applied to which objects. So here I just grabbed the screws and applied a material modifier to them, so they're all going to receive a specific value. Now I use my modifier utilities script to apply a bunch of different modifiers at a very specific spot in the stack. Now, you'll see I accidentally did the melt modifier here, but I will undo that. And once I've undone that, I'll get the real one I wanted, which was the material modifier. And it says it's being placed specifically from top at a value of 8, which means it's being placed before the turbo smooth on each object. And now I'm going to use another script called the parameter manager to change a whole bunch of values at the same time. So I can either grab each object and change it, or if I have a bunch of objects I want to change, I can change them all simultaneously using the parameter manager. So for example, every object I've selected here, I'll give a value of 3, and then it automatically applies value of 3 to every one of those modifiers. So just grabbing different parts and trying to make sure there's a variety of different colors. So some of them will get the darker metal, some will get the lighter metal, some will get the gold metal. And after I do some renders, I'll tweak them until I figure out what looks good in what spot. So those ones are all going to be gold because they all have a material value of 4 on the objects. And there you go. So I've rendered it, and you can see some are darker and some are lighter. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to tweak a few more of the objects to have some slightly different values, just so we have a really nice variety of values in there. And I'm going to tweak the colors just a little tiny bit and increase the glossiness value. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want each object to have a slightly different reflectivity. So again, I'm going to apply a multi-ID map. Then I'm going to make 4 different fall-offs, and each fall-off is going to have a slightly different index of refraction. And what that's going to do is it's going to make each different kind of metal a slightly different reflectivity, which again will add some more visual variety. It's all about adding visual variety, making sure that you don't have a whole ton of objects that have exactly the same look. Here I'm just adjusting the color of the gold a little bit, and there's the result. Again, just ever so tweaking the values until they're exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I want to apply my dirt not evenly over the surface, but actually make it more worn off at the edges. So to do that, I used my corner edge to vertex map script, and what that does is that applies different colors to the vertex map at different spots. So it grabs the edges, and the edges are black, and the non-edges, the flat areas, are white. Now you'll see in a couple of spots it did some weird things, and that's because it can only make the map as detailed as there are numbers of faces in the objects themselves. So now under the dirt opacity, I'm going to turn that into a composite map. Place my dirt as a bottom level. Then in the next level, I'm going to place a solid color, and what this does is, with an alpha of 0.25, that's just going to make it a little bit brighter. And then on the top level, I'm going to place my warp texture, which has a vertex color in the first slot, and the second slot is going to have noise. So the noise is going to modify the color of the vertex color map. So first of all, let's just look at the vertex color map. So there it is there. That's what it looks like. And that's what it looks like after being turbo smoothed. Now I have my noise, and I'm going to distort the vertex color map with my noise. Again, using text map preview to see that spot. So now I'm going to play around with my noise until I get the size and strength of noise that I want. So that's what it looks like right now. And I go in and I just change some of the clamping values a bit. And let's see if that looks good now combined with my vertex color. Looking a little bit better. Now I go into the output and I want to clamp it even further, so I clamp the value, and we'll see if that starts to look better. Okay, not quite what I want, so I adjust the output a little bit to see if I can get something with more black. There we go. Okay, that's starting to look a lot better. And go into my noise and just clamp the noise a little tiny bit more. Adjust my output again. Trying to get a little bit more black going on, a little harsher values. Process of shading usually involves lots of tweaking of little parameters and lots of test renders and see if it looks good or not. So make sure that while you're waiting for renders you have a good book to read, or a guitar nearby to play, or something. Getting closer. Okay, rename the map. And so now what that's going to do is that is going to take away the dirt from those edge areas. So the edge areas are going to reveal more metal, and the areas that are flatter are going to have more dirt, and the noise is there so that the end result isn't just very, very straight. So there's some variety. Some of the edges have a little more dirt, some edges have a little less dirt. Again, all just stuff to add some variety. So I'm tweaking the map a little tiny bit more. And there's the result. So you can see the edges have more metal on them and the flat areas have more of the dirt. So now a couple of the areas aren't looking very good, and that's because there's not enough geometry in there in order to really give them a good look using using the vertex map technique. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit of geometry in there just to make the effect look better. Now, if you get this object from a modeler and you didn't do it yourself, if you're going to change the geometry when you're doing your shading, definitely ask the modeler to make sure that it's not going to mess something up. Because, you know, you never know, maybe the director really liked some chamfered edge and adding extra geometry is just going to totally mess that up for him or something. So just, it's polite anyway to ask and make sure that adding a little bit of extra geometry so that your vertex map works isn't going to impact the model in any bad way. So now by adding that extra geometry, I now have a little bit better looking map. And then here's a close-up view of the tread. And you can really see how the edges don't have the material. So now I'm going to go in, and I've decided that the dirt map is still kind of bland because it's the same dirt sort of everywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a slightly more interesting dirt mask to blend between the metal areas and the dirt areas. And I'm taking a bunch of different layers that I created with custom brushes, and you know, using the dirt brushes that I showed you before, using scans which I've taken from photographs, scans that I've taken of pieces of paper covered in dirt, all kinds of different things. I'm just trying to create something that has a little more variety to it. So areas with lots of dirt, areas with not very much dirt, little tiny pieces of dirt, large pieces of dirt, just something more interesting than the previous dirt that we had. So I'm playing around with the opacity of the layers and their different modes in order to get what I'm looking for. Okay, back in 3D, I go into the dirt mask, and I'm going to go into my blended box map, which had the dirt opacity, and I'm going to replace it with dirt opacity 2, which is the much more complex dirt, which I think will look a lot better. And then I take a peek to see what it looks like using Text Map Preview. And that's looking far more interesting than the previous dirt I had assigned to the object. And now let's look at what the mask by itself will look like, including the vertex color map, which I've included. So there you go. Black areas will have no dirt, and the other areas will have dirt, and here's the result. So based on the result, I decided to do just a little more tweaking to the dirt opacity 2 map. Go back into Max and change the tiling just a bit. I decide to make it just a bit larger. And there we go. So this is now with it applied everywhere. All the different objects, and the different objects have different material modifiers on it, so that it gets one of the 4 different types of metal. But all the metal is all in one material, but there is still some variety within that one material, so that it doesn't look like the same metal everywhere. Now, I did a couple of things which I didn't show you here, and one of the things that I did was, as I said earlier, I ended up replacing the 6 different sided blended box map with just 3. And the other thing that I did was I put a multi-ID map into the reflection tint, because the 3 normal metals don't need a tint because they're just gray, but the last one does need a tint so that the reflections are tinted the same color as the gold. And there you can see the 3 different modifiers instead of the 6 that I had previously. So I just went in and redid them with the 3, since they were all applying the same map and I really didn't need all 6. And you can see how much cleaner the map tree is once I did that. Okay, so I got the basic metal in. Now it's time to do the dumpster. And to start off with the dumpster, I'm going to take our original metal, and I'm going to make a copy of it because the very base layer of the painted metal is going to be the original metal I used. But instead of having a bunch of different kinds of metal, I'm just going to have one kind of metal. So it's only going to have one color. You see I removed the multi-ID map there. It'll only have one tint on it. It'll only have one reflectivity. I don't need a bunch of different varieties, because you're only going to see a little of this metal. Mostly you're going to see the painted part. And I make it a little less reflective. Maybe a little bit more. Okay, and then I select the object and assign that material. Now, I take the metal and I put that inside a blend, and the second material, material 2, is going to be my paint material. So I turn that into a Brazil 2 Advanced, I call it Paint Matte. Give it a darkish color based on the color scheme we had before, getting rid of the highlight once again. And under reflectivity, I'm placing a fall off, and set it to Fresnel and set it to a much lower value than the metal, because the paint is not going to be as reflective as the metal is. And then in the environment slot again, grab my HDR that I had. So now, got my whole object, and I'm going to apply my blended box map to it. And I'm just going to take a peek at the size of the one I had on the metal, so I can have a reasonably similar size to the one I'm applying to my to the dumpster part. So there you go. And now I've just turned for the moment, the value of the blend to 100%, so we're only going to see the paint material first. Apply my Turbo Smooth, and you'll remember the Turbo Smooth must be lower in the stack than the mapping modifiers. So I went back and I got rid of the old mapping modifiers, put the Turbo Smooth on, and then applied my mapping modifiers back on top, which is the fastest way to do that. And there's the result. So it's got the general idea in there, but it's obviously going to require a lot of tweaking to make it look like paint. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the worn paint. And the way I'm doing that is, just like the last time, I've applied the corner edge script in order to bake out into the vertex map the corners of all the objects. And the corners are the areas where we're going to have the paint chipped off to reveal the metal underneath. So the automated script worked pretty well, but there's still a few areas that it missed, and those are areas we're going to play with by hand. So for example, right here, at the edge between these two objects, it didn't capture that. And that's just, I could either go in and keep playing with the values until it caught it, but I can also just manually give it the proper value. So here I just grab the object and grab the edges and then change the color, the vertex color. And then I'll do the same thing over here. So I'm going to grab an edge and then do an edge loop, then convert the edge selection to vertexes, and then change the vertex color. Now I'm going to look at the vertex color, and there you go. So that area is now black. So sometimes it's easier to do that than it is to just keep playing with the values in the script. But the script will do 99% of it for you. Okay, now I'm going to select a smaller area to do my test renders on. So I'm just going to hide everything except for this one little spot. And now I'm going to make my mask. And in the mask, I place my warp texture, place the noise in the warp slot and the vertex color in the first slot. Give it a warp amount. And now I'm going to take a look at my noise. So this is exactly the same process I did before with the metal, but this one is going to be driving the chipped paint. So the look of the noise I want to be slightly different because I want the noise to be much, much, much harsher. Because chipped paint tends to chip off in much bigger chunks. There are less areas of gray, less areas where it's sort of chipped off. It's either usually chipped off or it's not. So I'm going to go and really clamp the noise here to get the result I want. That's starting to look better. Now play around with my noise a bit, make it a bit bigger, clamp it a bit stronger, warp it a bit more. Basically just keep playing around. Eventually you get some sort of feel for what you need in order to get the results that you're after. But there's still plenty of tweaking. There we go. This is starting to look good. So now that is going to be the mask. And you see there you have the paint material, and then it chips off to reveal the metal underneath. And here's the result over the whole surface. Now it's pretty even, but we're going to deal with that later on. Right now we're just trying to get the basics in there. So I'm going to do a little bit more tweaking with my metal material. Okay, so next I'm going to create my paint material. Now what I did was I took a piece of paper and I took some acrylic paint and I just splattered a bunch of it around. And I've now taken a little piece of that and I'm going to use my cloner in order to get rid of those seams. Anytime I can, I really enjoy doing stuff like grabbing some acrylic paint, real acrylic paint on paper, and using that for textures, because it gets me away from the computer, and I spend so long in front of the computer, it's nice to actually not have to be near it for some period of time. So I highly recommend, you'll end up using the computer a lot for a lot of stuff anyway, so any chance you get to do something non-computer related in the real world, jump at it. So just playing with the contrast, and I made it black and white. So what I'm doing here is this is going to be the color and also the bump. But the color itself, I'm just creating a pattern which I'm then going to multiply into the color to give the color some variation. But the color itself isn't going to be in my bitmap. The color is going to be inside of 3D, which you'll see in a little bit. So I just took another acrylic paint layer that I made, and I put it on top of the first one just to create some more variety. And I'm changing the modes and the opacity until I get something that has sort of a nice combination of the two different patterns. And again, use the offset just to make sure that there isn't any big nasty seams. Some last little tweaks just to get rid of some details that I think are going to be problematic. Okay, so now back in here, I'm going to use that paint and I'm going to create a map, a blended box map for that map. There you go. Now in the paint, I'm going to go into the color, and the color is now going to be a composite with two layers. The first layer is going to be the paint layer, and it's going to be overlaid on top of a solid color, and the solid color is going to be that dark grayish color. So I'm blending the original color with an overlay of the paint texture to create the final material. And then I'm going to go in and just tweak with a color correction ever so slightly the paint. And there you go. So that's already starting to look much more interesting. Next, I'm going to take a photo, which I took of an actual painted material, and I'm going to drag that into my first guy. And once again, just play around with the layer modes until I get something a little more interesting, and play around with the opacity and whatever else, just to give more visual detail. So it's not the same thing all over the place. And don't forget to make that layer tileable too. There we go. Since it's not contributing a lot to the final look, I'm not as careful when I do my use the paintbrush to tile it, because you're just not going to see enough of it for it to be really obvious. Or if it does become obvious when you look at it in 3D, you can go in and make some tweaks. So saved it over top of my paint. Then group those, and that'll be my color. And then duplicate the group, and this will be my bump. And another thing I wanted to add to the bump was this is a picture of that dumpster that I had before, and there were some really nice sort of little poppy areas, little specks going on there, and I want some of that on my from my bump map on my paint. So again, I play with the modes until I find one that blends it in with the stuff below. Change the opacity a bit. Play with its levels to clamp it. I invert it so the spots are bumping out instead of bumping in. So the little spots are now white, which will bump out from my bump map. And now I save it as my paint bump layer. So again, I want to make my map for the paint bump, and then I drop it into the bump slot of my paint material, and there's the result. A little too strong, so I reduce the strength of the bump, and to make the surface a little bit less reflective. Trying to find that sweet spot that looks nice. So that's looking better. Maybe a little bit less bump, again a little bit less reflectivity. And here is the example of that paint I had and the rendered result, just so I'm getting some idea of how the two match up and if they match up pretty well. Okay, so now I'm making my rust material, and that's a photograph of rust that I took. And I'm now going to take the metal and paint and turn that into a blend material, and then in the second slot of that I'm going to make my rust material. So I changed it to ordinaire. And just doing some renaming here. And then I'm sticking a little bit of noise in the bump slot. Now I could do a bitmap for this too, but for a noise like this, which is not contributing that much necessarily to the final look, I tend to use procedurals because it's just easier to set up. So now I'm just going to do a little test to see how the noise looks and the rust map. So it's looking a little chunky. And so here I'm taking a look just at the bump itself, making it a little bit smaller, a little finer. Tiling my rust map a little bit more, so it's not quite as large. And then there it is with the noise. Sometimes you'll see weird artifacts on the renders, by the way, and that's just because I stop the render halfway through, and it just leaves old buckets when I do that. But it's all about seeing the results as fast as you can and seeing if the results look the way you want it to look. So here I'm replacing the standard material with a Brazil 2 advanced material, and then putting the stuff that I had before into the Brazil 2 advanced material. So basically I'm just converting the standard material I had into the Brazil 2 advanced material. Here I'm just taking some quick peeks at my reference, and it looks like the rust should be a little bit brighter, so I threw a color correct over top of my rust color map, and I'm just brightening it a bit and changing its saturation a bit to get something a little closer to the reference material that I had. And here you go. There is the whole thing. So there is the general patterns on the back of my guy and the metal underneath. So now I'm just going to quickly do the eye. And for this I've decided I want sort of a HAL eye, like from 2001. So I take the highlight off the surface, and I plop the HDR into the environment map, place a fall off into reflectivity, set the IOR to something appropriate, and then under luminosity I create another fall off which goes from black to white. And what this does is this, black to yellow. And what this does is this simulates the look of the eye having a glow in the middle of it. And then I can control exactly where the transition occurs by playing with the mix curve on the fall off, which is in the luminosity channel. So there I made it really bright in the center, and now I'm trying to get a nice fall off in there, which will take some playing with the curve. That's starting to look more the way I want it. And there's the result. So we're not going to see too much of it, so I think that'll be good. Now let's quickly do the road. So I'm applying some UV maps, planar from the top on the 3 different surfaces of the road. Now for the sidewalk, I have to do a UV unwrap because of all the front-facing faces of the sidewalk edge, which the planar map will cause streaking on. So I unwrap it, and now I'm just pulling those faces down a little bit so that they receive some more of the material that's going to be applied to the surface. So make sure that it stays in 0 to 1, and I'm using my UV placer tool just to make sure that the values are exactly at 0 and 1. Now a real quick way to take something and pull it into Photoshop is just, if it's a planar map, you can just sort of put the view in the right spot inside of Max and hit print screen and then grab and yank it into Photoshop. Which, when you don't need things that are exactly placed, it's a real fast and easy way of going about getting templates inside of Photoshop without having to do a full UV render. So now I'm doing the same thing with the gutter. And then I'm making the image really large. What I tend to do is I tend to make all my maps in Photoshop really huge, like 4 to 8K, and then I don't necessarily render with those maps. What I'll do is, before I render with it, I'll take the map and I'll make it smaller. But I always have a Photoshop version of it, which is huge. And what that lets me do is that it's really easy to take a map and make it smaller, but it's not easy to take a map and make it bigger. And so if I always have a really big map in Photoshop, I can always go smaller with it, and I never have to worry about having to make it bigger because I need more detail. So that's another reason why the 64-bit computer is nice, because you can do that and not have to worry about memory as much. So I'm just setting up the template for the sidewalk, which is going to be a combination of a screen cap of the actual UVs and a screen cap of the object from above. And now I have my templates. So now I'm going to start making the actual materials. So in this case, I've gotten a bunch of photographs of actual pavement, and I just did the high pass filter so that I can even out the colors on the photos, because you'll notice all the photos are a little bit darker on the edges than they are in the center. So there is our first guy, evened out. You see the difference? And then I have to do it to the other 4 photographs. The reason I took 4 photographs is because I have a really big surface of this stuff, and so I wanted a really big photo. And my camera only does 3K images or so. So by taking multiple photographs and then stitching them together, I'm able to get something much higher res, such as 8K, pretty easily. This photo here has a little bit of extra, a crack or something, so I'm just going to get rid of that. Anything like a crack, if I wanted to add that, that's a specific pattern. That's not a general pattern. Right now I'm just worried about adding the general pattern to the objects. Okay, so now that I've done it to all the different objects, I'm going to create a much larger image, and then I'm going to yank the other textures into place that I had. So I'm going to put all 4 textures side by side. And then they're not perfectly even with each other, as you can see. But that's okay, because I'm going to go and change that. So I apply the high pass filter now to the whole surface. So the high pass filter is not only good for evening the original photo, but then evening between different photos. So that's a good start, although you can see there's some weirdness in the middle where the cross is, and so I go in and I use my cloner brush to remove those seams. Okay, it looks pretty good. Now don't forget, we got to get the other seams too. And I adjust the levels a bit just so I have a material that's more the color I'm looking for. Remove the saturation a bit. The original photograph was a little bit yellow due to the lighting, so I'm trying to get rid of the lighting, and that's why I desaturated it to get some of the yellow out. Okay, so there is my road, and there is my road texture that I created. I'm going to save it. Adjust the brightness contrast a bit more to get a nice dark asphalt. Now, again, I want to fill out the entire template that I had, which I do using my cloner. Still a little bit more of a tweak. Save the PSD, and now I'm going to move on to my sidewalk. So again, took a bunch of photographs of a sidewalk from up above, and took several of them so I can merge them together to form my final sidewalk. Okay, so there's the different ones. I flatten the image and go after those seams. And then fill up the whole surface of the sidewalk with that texture. Get a little brighter. And the gutter is going to have the same material. Okay, now I'm going to make my materials. They're going to be ordinaire since it's a rough surface. And I'm going to grab my 3-bit maps on my 3 different materials. Now in these cases I just copied the color into the bump. Sometimes you'll want to do different maps. In fact, most of the time you'll probably want to do different maps for the color of the bump. But in these cases, this is not going to be the main focus of the final image, and so having the same map in both is probably going to look fine. But you might want to consider making different ones if you know, if you're going to spend a lot of time staring at the road really closely. But using the same one in all the different slots means you have far less maps in memory, which can really help. So now I'm applying my Turbo Smooth, and there's the final result. Decide to do a little more tweaking to the roughness of the surfaces. And I tweak, again in Photoshop, just a little bit the brightness, using a levels adjustment layer. Make it a little bumpier. And there you go.